Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay and today we'll be discussing littleness. I'll be centering the discussion around an essay I wrote called Burning Down the House, which stemmed from observations around the illegal felling of the Sycamore Gap tree, otherwise known as the Robin Hood tree, which was a 150-year-old sycamore tree next to Hadrian's Wall, the ancient Roman structure in northern England. And the felony occurred in 2023. But first, let's talk a little bit about littleness from the course. From Chapter 9, The Acceptance of the Atonement, it says this under the subheading, The Two Evaluations. It is perfectly obvious that if the Holy Spirit looks with love on all he perceives, he looks with love on you. His evaluation of you is based on his knowledge of what you are, and so he evaluates you truly. And this evaluation must be in your mind because he is. The ego is also in your mind because you have accepted it there. Its evaluation of you, however, is the exact opposite of the Holy Spirit's because the ego does not love you. A little further on, you then have two conflicting evaluations of yourself in your mind, and they cannot both be true. You do not yet realize how completely different these evaluations are because you do not understand how lofty the Holy Spirit's perception of you really is. Further down in that section, whenever you question your values, say, God himself is incomplete without me. Remember this when the ego speaks, and you will not hear it. The truth about you is so lofty that nothing unworthy of God is worthy of you. Okay, so this idea that the truth about us is so lofty and we are loved, the truth about us is totally lovable and it is beauty itself. But the ego in us tells us that we are the home of evil, darkness and sin. And there's a passage in the Course where it says, you fear that if people were to see the truth in you, they would turn around in horror. So we all think we're a bit of a Frankenstein's creature in that respect. Well, this essay explores that belief in littleness. Littleness can encompass all of what we hate about ourselves, what the ego tells us about ourselves, that we are small and insignificant and unworthy. This essay explores that within the context of A Course in Miracles and the events of that sycamore tree being cut down. And then at the conclusion of the essay, I'm going to link everything up with a discussion of the symbology of trees, particularly in the Bible, and how this relates to this discussion of littleness. So let's begin with the essay. Burning Down the House, Part 1, from The Bridge of Return. Quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that the first real problem I faced in my life was that of beauty." End of quote. And that's from a book called The Temple of the Golden Pavillion, written by Yukio Mishima, one of Japan's finest writers. Nature lovers, history buffs, and many everyday people woke up to distressing news recently. England's famous Sycamore Gap tree had been chopped down in a brutal act of vandalism. The iconic 200-year-old tree in northern England stood next to the Roman landmark Hadrian's Wall, a UNESCO World Heritage Site which attracts thousands of visitors each year. The question on everyone's lips following the news of the attack, why would anyone do such a thing? I don't know the vandals' motives, but the seemingly senseless destruction of a much-loved public monument, a precious beacon of natural beauty, as one local called it, reminded me of Yukio Mishima's novel The Temple of the Golden Pavillion. The story revolves around the inner experience of the narrator, Mizoguchi, a young Buddhist acolyte. Unattractive, physically weak, born into poverty and suffering a pronounced stutter, Mizoguchi feels an outsider and holds himself aloof from others. His reverence is reserved for the Temple of the Golden Pavillion, where he trains and lives. Every day, religious devotees and tourists visit the temple and admire its beauty. Mizoguchi too marvels at the temple, becoming obsessed with it as an ideal of beauty and perfection. But as he increasingly reflects on the lack of beauty in his own life, he begins to hate the temple and decides he must destroy it. He sets fire to the pavilion, reducing it to a pile of ash and debris. Interestingly, the Golden Pavillion is an actual place in Kyoto, Japan, and, like Hadrian's Wall, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Mishima's novel was based on true events. In 1950, the temple was set on fire by Shokin Hayashi, a 21-year-old acolyte. Subtitle: How to Win Friends. As small children, the basic need to be noticed is obvious. "Mum, Dad, look at me," is a child's familiar demand before they do something amazing like a handstand or jump into a swimming pool. And of course, there's all those drawings brought home from school. What is it about young children that calls for so much witnessing? According to the famous salescraft guru Dale Carnegie, a need to feel significant travels with us throughout life. Take an interest in someone, ask them about their likes and dislikes, applaud their efforts and goals. That's how you'll win friends and influence people. Likewise, simply overlook someone if you want to make of them an enemy. Feeling significant relates to feeling valued, someone worth noticing. But what if you believe you have no currency in the world, as did Mishima's young acolyte? Who will notice you? Attack then becomes a way to feel powerful, get noticed, and exercise revenge. 3 birds with 1 stone. In Mizoguchi's act of destruction, he went from a seemingly inconsequential figure to a person of interest. Would Shokin Hayashi's name be etched into history if he hadn't burnt down the temple in 1950? For some people, it is less painful to burden the guilt of a crime than to experience the shame of being a nobody. Subtitle: Grandeur versus Grandiosity. A Course in Miracles distinguishes between the grandeur of God and the grandiosity of the ego. Where grandeur implies a natural state of dignity and splendour, grandiosity refers to attempts to appear impressive and important. If we identify with the ego, we can either feel the shame associated with incompletion, with littleness, or try to cover over our despair with grandiosity. In contrast, to identify with the wholeness of our self, spiritual self, is to identify with God's grandeur. The ego represents the desire to be separate from God, and to choose this is to choose littleness. We'll then believe that the littleness is real, rather than the stuff of an illusory self. Competitive feelings will kick in, and we'll turn to grandiosity for protection from our littleness. Littleness and grandiosity, shame and pride, are opposites we'll alternate between when we're identified with the ego. Our grandeur therefore lies in acknowledgement of who travels with us. Quote, "How can I be alone when God always goes with me? How can I be doubtful and unsure of myself when perfect certainty abides in Him? Let me not cherish illusions about myself. I am perfect because God goes with me wherever I go." End of quote. If God goes with us wherever we go, then there is no separation and no foundation for shame and guilt. But if, like Mizoguchi, we don't recognise our pain for what it is, we'll look to the outside world to fix our insecurity, reinforcing our sense of littleness, further obscuring the light within. Quote, "When you strive for anything in this world in the belief that it will bring you peace, you are belittling yourself and blinding yourself to glory. Yet what you do not realise each time you choose is that your choice is your evaluation of yourself. Choose littleness and you will not have peace, for you will have judged yourself unworthy of it, and whatever you offer as a substitute is much too poor a gift to satisfy you." End of quote. As I reflect on the ego's temptations to choose littleness, disguised as ways to feel powerful and significant, I'm reminded of the 80s hit Skin Deep by the English rock group The Stranglers. The song is a caution that not all friends are genuine. Quote, "Better watch out for the skin deep." End of quote. And that's what all ego promises are, skin deep. Below their superficial allure, their seeming design to help build you up, is their real aim to further mar your self-concept in littleness so you won't remember your magnitude and will continue to turn to the ego for solutions to your insecurity. The ego cares only for its own relevance. Subtitle: Our special function. The one thing we can seek that won't lead to littleness is to fulfill our function of forgiveness. Quote, "For your function is not little, and it is only by finding your function and fulfilling it that you can escape from littleness." End of quote. Forgiveness is our special function, which fulfills our need for significance. All that we made to defend us from our littleness, our special relationships with people, activities, causes, and roles, can now be used to fulfill our special function of forgiveness, which, somewhat paradoxically, is our only shared function. Quote, "The Holy Spirit needs your special function, that His may be fulfilled. Think not you lack a special value here. You wanted it, and it is given you. All that you made can serve salvation easily and well." End of quote. So just as an aside here, special function, the use of the word special here is like valuable function. When we say something, oh, that's very special, we're applying value to it. But the Holy Spirit's value, or the right-minded sense of value in terms of our special function, is that it is shared with everybody, and that's why it is special in the sense of valuable. Okay, so carrying on. As always with the Course, we don't need to seek for the positive, but to look upon and undo the negative. Our special function is our way of undoing shame and guilt. We don't have to strive for our magnitude because we already have it. Instead, all our striving should be directed against littleness. We need to protect our magnitude. Quote, "All your striving must be directed against littleness, for it does require vigilance to protect your magnitude in this world. To hold your magnitude in perfect awareness in a world of littleness is a task the little cannot undertake. Yet it is asked of you in tribute of your magnitude and not your littleness, nor is it asked of you alone. The power of God will support every effort you make on behalf of His dear Son." End of quote. Protecting our magnitude involves vigilance for the ego's gifts of specialness, substitutes for our special function, which we hope will make us complete, valuable, and safe. The ego's idols of specialness are especially tempting during transition periods when a long-held role ends and we feel redundant, as in the empty nest syndrome, or, conversely, when a long-awaited role seems forever in the making. Our faith is tested at such times, as is explored in part 2 of this essay, which is framed around John Milton's poem Paradise Regained, a reimagining of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. Burning Down the House, Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at the distinction A Course in Miracles makes between the grandeur of our spiritual self and the littleness, sometimes masked as grandiosity, of our ego-centered identity. Instead of seeking for our true magnitude, the Course tells us to look at how we choose against it. We need vigilance to protect what we already have and are. The theme of being vigilant to protect our magnitude is echoed in John Milton's poem Paradise Regained, the sequel to his more famous Paradise Lost, which reimagined Adam and Eve's fall from grace, having succumbed to Satan's temptations. In the final lines of Paradise Lost, we find the couple exiled from Eden, about to embark on their path of toil and suffering, now the lot of humankind. So here is the last stanza from Paradise Lost. "Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way." Subtitle: Standing Firm, the Role of Vigilance, Affirmation and Faith. Where Paradise Lost described how man's disobedience in the face of temptation led to the fall, Paradise Regained centres on how Jesus' unshakable faith recovered paradise for humankind. Rather than focus on the crucifixion as the redeeming act, as most Christian writers do, Milton suggests that Jesus' temptation in the wilderness provided the decisive moment which set the redemptive process in motion and is therefore the key act of salvation. The crucifixion, in Milton's thinking, wouldn't be possible without the inner strength and faith confirmed and revealed in the desert encounter. Paradise Regained mainly comprises a series of debates between Satan and Jesus, in which Satan tempts him to stray from his faith, and Jesus steadfastly bats the temptation away through his own spiritual reasoning. We can think of Satan's temptations as the wild thoughts that intrude on our mind when self-doubt takes hold, as with Mishima's acolyte. They are the ego's incitements that a special action, object or person will make amends for a perceived slight or otherwise bring us satisfaction. They are thoughts of special love, that will make me happy, and special hate, that will show them. Either way, these thoughts are part of a private world, a fantasy in which we believe our thoughts to be true. We fall for their allure when we lack faith and haven't unreservedly accepted our special function as the only thing that matters. Subtitle: Setting the Scene. Placing Jesus' temptations in the desert within the context of his life helps relate his experience to our own spiritual course. Early in Milton's poem, we find John the Baptist baptizing Jesus in the Jordan River. As Jesus is cleansed by the water, God's voice proclaims him as his Son, in whom he is well pleased, thereby confirming him as the much anticipated Messiah. Shortly afterward, Jesus reflects on how his life of obscurity is ending as his public ministry approaches. But first, he feels moved to travel into the desert wilderness. Quote, "Me, his beloved Son, in whom alone he was well pleased, by which I knew the time now full, that I no more should live obscure, but openly begin, as best becomes the authority which I derived from heaven. And now by some strong motion I am led into this wilderness, to what intent I learn not yet, perhaps I need not know, for what concerns my knowledge God reveals." End of quote. Here we already see Jesus' strength of faith. He is happy to go into the wilderness without knowing why, but is sure all will be revealed as is necessary. In the meantime, he finds the solitude conducive to deep thought and meditation. After 40 days and nights, Jesus is still none the wiser about how his time in the wilderness fits into the greater scheme of things, but he is content to wait and listen, to stand by his post, as Ralph Waldo Emerson might say. Soon enough, however, he'll have cause to guard the portal of his mind, another great metaphor from Emerson, because Satan heads to the desert to tempt him. Satan knew Jesus was not your average Joe, that he wouldn't fall for simple lures such as women, money or fame. Satan would have to use well-couched fraud and well-woven snares to get his man. He would disguise worldly temptations as things that could help Jesus fulfill his mission. If he could find a fault line in Jesus' faith and seduce him into taking him as his guide, then Jesus' inner communion with God would be broken, his message and purpose lost. Likewise, as our work with forgiveness progresses and we withdraw our projections of shame and guilt, we travel further towards our own ministry, becoming clearer channels for expressing love, what the Course calls our creations. Here, the ego will feel doubly threatened and become more insistent that we direct our attention again to the outer world, emphasising its own defences to littleness. The ego also becomes wily. As we connect with deeper, more repressed aspects of shame and the core issues that evoke these feelings, the ego may tell us we are justified in feeling the way we do and that it has a plan to make us feel better. Revenge. Whether that take the form of destruction or the triumph of grandiosity, as Frank Sinatra said, the best revenge is massive success. If we follow the ego instead of remembering our only meaningful function, we will have succumbed to temptation, delayed our happiness, and prolonged our pain. Subtitle: The World at Your Feet. The two principal ways Satan tries to spoil Jesus' mission are to test his faith in his Father's care and his resolve to keep his eyes on the prize of his redemptive mission. When Satan first encounters Jesus and discovers that he hasn't eaten for days, he plants the seeds of doubt regarding God's providence. Other prophets, he points out, trod the same wilderness and would have starved if God hadn't sent his angels to give them food. Yet here Jesus was, without a bite to eat. Clearly, God must have forsaken him, suggests Satan. Jesus, unmoved, replies that while others were in need, he isn't. He might be without food, but he isn't suffering, so why would God send him what he doesn't need? Satan tries again. He comments on how Jesus is waiting for guidance, yet the time for action is upon him, and God remains silent. Again, the insinuation is that God has forsaken his Son. "My time has not yet come," replies Jesus, his faith unwavering. Without faith in God's love, we'll interpret our world through the eyes of littleness. Feelings of deprivation, injustice, shame, God treats others better, he's forgotten me. Depression and anger will be our experience and will generate wild thoughts. Behind the destruction of the temple of the Golden Pavillion, the Sycamore Gap tree, or whatever object seems to have been given special favour, stands a God who snubbed us. But as the Course says, all perception represents a wish, an image that we want to be true. If God doesn't care about us, if he isn't with us, then the separation is real and we are on our own. We might feel insecure and lonely, but at least we're autonomous and we'll find this attractive as long as we doubt the gifts of forgiveness and faith. This is the temptation below the skin-deep promises of the ego. Satan tries again. Adjusting his approach, he decides to divert Jesus from his purpose by enhancing the allure of worldly things. He tempts Jesus with money, but in a roundabout way, telling him that while his heart appears to have high designs, he doesn't have all that he needs to achieve high action. He's unknown, has no networks or friends in high places. His father is a carpenter, he was brought up in poverty, and here he is alone in the desert. Satan continues, "Money brings honour, friends, conquest, and realms. Therefore, if at great things thou wouldst arrive, get riches first, get wealth, and treasures heap." Satan offers to give Jesus wealth, saying that money can give him the power and influence he needs to do great things, whereas virtue, valour, and wisdom will leave him high and dry. Jesus doesn't budge. "Yet wealth without these three is impotent," he says. Jesus goes on to say he doesn't want to rule like a king who rules over bodies yet can't govern his own passions. The godly person, he says, has influence by allowing his soul to govern him, thereby attracting the souls of others. Quote, "To know, and knowing worship God aright, is yet more kingly. This attracts the soul, governs the inner man and nobler part, that other over the body only reigns." End of quote. Jesus' response in Milton's poem is akin to the Course idea that it's the peace in our minds that influences others, not our actions or words per se. "Love and do what you will," said St. Augustine. "If there is love in your mind, then all else is secondary. All else will be for the good." The Course goes a step further by saying that it is literally the peace in your mind that influences others. This is because minds are joined at a level beyond time and space. The choice we make in our minds reminds others near and far of the choice available in their mind. This is the healing. What we do or say from a peaceful place merely takes a form through which someone can accept the healing. Money or worldly power, therefore, isn't necessary to be of influence. We are always influencing others through the choice we make within our mind. We have the power to reflect and reinforce the ego thought system of shame, guilt, littleness, and competitive interests, or the Holy Spirit's thought system of wholeness, shared interests, and innocence. This is why the Course says that we are never healed alone. Subtitle: Hitting Where It Hurts. Since illusions of God's negligence and promises of power failed to lure Jesus away from his faith, Satan brings out the big guns. He gets personal, taunting Jesus by suggesting that the real reason he won't accept his offers is that he is too inexperienced in the ways of the world. It's not faith or high ideals that are stopping him from taking action, but fear and weakness. Satan goes on to say that he can instruct Jesus in the regal arts of kings and leaders if he really does want to do great things. Jesus stands firm, resisting Satan's attempt to shame him into accepting his help, his ways. Jesus answers again that his time has not yet come, and that when it comes, he won't need anything from Satan. Likewise, when the going gets tough on our spiritual journey, particularly at major thresholds of change, the seeds of self-doubt can creep in, and we can wonder if our spiritual aspirations are an illusion, a mere escape from the demands of life in the real world. Does forgiveness really offer everything we want? Are we really getting somewhere? Again, this is a time for faith. The conflict between the worldly voice and the spiritual one reminds me of Jung's reflections on his decision to give up his academic career. This occurred when his soul, what he otherwise refers to as his inner personality, the number 2 personality, or at times the unconscious, to distinguish it from the rational conscious personality, was calling him to give more time to the images and themes that were arising in his mind, and which later played a pivotal role in the development of his theories. Quote, "In my life, I always had to follow my inner personality, the number 2. Thus, I also had to give up my academic career. I had 2 alternatives. Either I forge a career as an academic, a path which lay smooth before me, or I follow my higher calling. The higher calling told me to follow those strange fantasies which had begun to emerge, but which I could not make public. So I either forge a career, or I focus on what seems to me more important, the eternal. To have been a professor or not, what does that really matter? It is just as insignificant as whether I have a doctorate or not. Of course it was frustrating to have to renounce a career. I raged against the decision, and it was painful in many respects. But those are all transitory emotions. Fundamentally, they are meaningless. Remaining in touch with the unconscious, that is what is important. And if one concentrates on what number 2 wants and says, then all the pain fades away." End of quote. The most important thing, Jung's remaining in touch with the unconscious, is what philosopher Soren Kierkegaard called operating from subjective truth, the kind of truth that moved Jesus to head toward the desert. This might leave us wanting in the eyes of the world, which look for outer signs of progress, purpose and value, but it keeps us in touch with our magnitude and represents a decision to go where our healing, and therefore everyone else's, lies. It also helps us bring forth whatever is unique to ourselves in terms of our personal potentialities, and this too will benefit others. Returning to Milton's poem, Satan continues with a few more deviously put temptations, and Jesus remains firm, continuously identifying with his magnitude. Eventually, this literally tips Satan over the edge. He takes Jesus to the top of a high tower, goads him to jump off and let God break his fall with his celestial hand, but Jesus doesn't take the bait. Deliriously frustrated, Satan falls from the tower himself. Having withstood all that Satan could throw at him by way of temptation, Jesus is carried away by angels and set down upon a green field where a heavenly array of food is laid out before him. So, the story ends nicely, the message is clear. Faith will inspire any necessary action if only we are vigilant for our magnitude. We can say that whenever we experience littleness, the ego has been in our ear, questioning our value and purpose through comparisons and preoccupying us with maladaptive solutions. Recalling the importance of our special function is one way to tap into our magnitude and get back on track. Another, as the following passage from the Course suggests, is to remember that no matter what the ego, or Antichrist, says, if we are not happy, it's because we have chosen to listen to the wrong guide. Quote, "We said you can begin a happy day with a determination not to make decisions by yourself, and yet you cannot make decisions by yourself. The only question really is with what you choose to make them, for they are made with idols or with God, and you ask help of Antichrist or Christ, and which you choose will join with you and tell you what to do. End of quote. And end of the essay. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about trees, about the trees in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis, it describes there being a tree at the centre of Eden, and this tree was called the tree of life. Now, Adam and Eve were allowed to eat fruit from this tree, the tree of life. In fact, they were encouraged to eat fruit of every tree, including the tree of life, except for one other tree called the tree of knowledge. So just a little bit more about the tree of life. The tree of life is like a symbol for God and for God's life. So to eat of the tree of life was to partake in that unity with God as being part of his creation and part of his will, having the same will as God. So that was okay. Adam and Eve could eat from that tree. They were encouraged to eat from that tree. But instead, they decided to eat from the tree of knowledge, which in the Bible meant knowing right from wrong. It's a symbol for being able to judge. In the Course, it says eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge in the Bible is a symbolic expression for usurping the ability for self-creating. So what the Course is saying there, it's a symbolic expression for being your own boss. It says, now I am in the position of being able to judge right from wrong, good, bad. I have the power of oversight that only God had before. I am now in a position to challenge his authority. The tree of life represents God's own life and his creative power. It's like you're partaking in God's life, being one with him. But the tree of knowing good and bad, it represents taking the authority to do what's good in your eyes, judging things on your own. So think of the Sycamore Gap tree again, and the beauty and majesty of that tree could symbolise the tree of life. And rather than choose to partake of the tree of life, of God's oneness, we chop it down. We decide to get rid of it. We envy the beauty, majesty, and the authority of that tree, and we decide to chop it down. And then we're left with our littleness. Chopping down the Sycamore Gap tree can then be like a symbol of eating from the tree of knowledge, the forbidden tree. So every time that we decide that we know what's best, we know what to do, we know how to judge, or that we judge others or ourselves, it's like we're taking an axe to that tree of life. But of course we can't do that in reality. And that's the whole atonement principle of the Course, that we never chop down the tree of life. We never separated from God. But that is the horrible thought that we have in our minds. And think of the outrage and the sorrow and the distress that everybody had when images of the chopped down tree were made available to the whole world. And it just seemed like a senseless act. What good could come from that? Why would somebody do that? Well, that's the kind of outrage and bewilderment and distress that exists in the deep recesses of our unconscious mind whenever we choose to listen to the ego's voice and go our own way. There's a wonderful workbook lesson in the Course. It's 135, and it's called If I Defend Myself, I Am Attacked. In this workbook lesson, it makes the correlation between defensiveness and planning. And it says this, I'm reading from paragraph 14. It is perhaps not easy to perceive that self-initiated plans are but defences, with the purpose all of them were made to realise. They are the means by which a frightened mind would undertake its own protection at the cost of truth. This is not difficult to realise in some forms which these self-deceptions take, where the denial of reality is very obvious. yet planning is not often recognised as a defence. Now, in the case of the Temple of the Golden Pavillion and burning that down, in Yukio Mishima's novel, you get an insight into the acolyte's planning, his self-initiated plans to defend himself from his own feelings of ugliness in the face of the beauty and admiration everybody had for the Golden Temple. So that's a stark illustration of how self-initiated plans are a defence. Carrying on with paragraph 15, the mind engaged in planning for itself is occupied in setting up control of future happenings. It does not think that it will be provided for unless it makes its own provisions. Time becomes a future emphasis to be controlled by learning and experience obtained from past events and previous beliefs. It overlooks the present, for it rests on the idea the past has taught enough to let the mind direct its future course. So we do not think we will be provided for unless we make our own provisions. That shows that when we are making plans on our own, we have identified with littleness. We feel so little that we are alone in the whole universe and have to provide for ourselves because nothing would provide for us. We are so insignificant. So it's not just the kind of planning of cutting down the sycamore tree or burning the Temple of the Golden Pavillion. Those are clear defences to feeling little and the insecurities associated with that. But it's our self-initiated planning for our own safety, our own security. It doesn't mean that we don't do things like have insurance policies and check our bank accounts and things like that. But if we do it on our own and kind of disassociate our inner teacher, split them off whenever it comes to certain things like money or status, and kind of split off that part of our mind where the Holy Spirit abides and not let them come into those areas to help us perceive them differently and deal with them from a sense of security rather than insecurity, then that planning that we do on our own is a defence, and it will only increase our sense of littleness and insecurity. And everything that we do will be based on past learning, and so that ensures that we take the past into the future. Of course, the past was never very satisfying, and so our lives appear to drag wearily along. So I'll skip to paragraph 19. Your present trust in Him, capital H, is the defence that promises a future undisturbed, without a trace of sorrow, and with joy that constantly increases, as this life becomes a holy instant, set in time, but heeding only immortality. Let no defences but your present trust direct the future, and this life becomes a meaningful encounter with the truth that only your defences would conceal. So that is how we partake of the fruit from the tree of life. That is how we partake of God's oneness. We trust that practicing forgiveness, practicing our special function whenever we feel insecure about anything, we trust that that is what is going to keep us heading in the right direction. And skipping down to paragraph 23, if there are plans to make, you will be told of them. They may not be the plans you thought were needed, nor indeed the answers to the problems which you thought confronted you, but they are answers to another kind of question which remains unanswered, yet in need of answering, until the answer, capital A, comes to you at last. So this idea of being able to be in communion with the Holy Spirit, or what the Course calls to be host to God, is such a noble, valuable thing to be, yet we choose not to when we decide to judge things on our own. In chapter 9, under the 2 evaluations, there's this quote, "With the grandeur of God in you, you have chosen to be little and to lament your littleness." So I think of the acolyte in Mishima's story again. that with the grandeur of God in him, he has chosen to identify with his body and then lament his littleness, as we all do whenever we identify with our bodies, because no matter what our state our bodies are in, we will always compare and we will always find fault, because that is what the ego does. The ego wants us to feel guilty and shameful. You cannot get around that. The ego doesn't like us. So in closing, I'd just like to read straight through the last 3 paragraphs of Workbook Lesson 135, because I think they're very nice sentiments to finish on. So here they are, from Lesson 135, paragraphs 24 through 26. All your defences have been aimed at not receiving what you will receive today, and in the light and joy of simple trust, you will but wonder why you ever thought that you must be defended from release. Heaven asks nothing. It is hell that makes extravagant demands for sacrifice. You give up nothing in these times today when, undefended, you present yourself to your Creator as you really are. He has remembered you. Today we will remember him, for this is Easter time in your salvation, and you rise again from what was seeming death and hopelessness. Now is the light of hope reborn in you, for now you come without defence, to learn the part for you within the plan of God. What little plans or magical beliefs can still have value when you have received your function from the voice for God himself? Try not to shape this day as you believe would benefit you most, for you cannot conceive of all the happiness that comes to you without your planning. Learn today, and all the world will take this giant stride and celebrate your Easter time with you. Throughout the day, as foolish little things appear to raise defensiveness in you and tempt you to engage in weaving plans, remind yourself this is a special day for learning, and acknowledge it with this. This is my Easter time, and I would keep it holy. I will not defend myself, because the Son of God needs no defence against the truth of his reality. So I said I was going to end by reading that, but I've just got one more thing to say. I want to go back to the very first sentence of the essay, Burning Down the House, and it was a quote from the Temple of the Golden Pavillion, and it's about Mizoguchi, the acolyte who burnt down the Golden Pavillion. It's his own reflection, and this is what he has to say. It is no exaggeration to say that the first real problem I faced in my life was that of beauty. So I would like to end with a little bit about beauty. There's a wonderful passage in the course. It's in chapter 8, section 7, and the subtitle is The Body as a Means of Communication. And I'm going to read a little bit from paragraph 3 and 4. The Holy Spirit does not see the body as you do, because he knows the only reality of anything is the service it renders God on behalf of the function he gives it. The body is beautiful or ugly, peaceful or savage, helpful or harmful, according to the use to which it is put. The Course also tells us that the body will be healthy when it is being used as a means of communication, of communicating the Holy Spirit's message. But the distinction between what the world calls health and what the Course calls health, what the world calls beauty and what the Course calls beauty, needs to be made. And in this, I would like to give an example from my own life. Many years ago, when I was studying and living in some student accommodation, I was talking to a friend who was very distressed. She had overheard some other students talking about her, talking about all the things that they thought were annoying. Well, she was very upset and in a difficult place. But she asked me to give her a very honest opinion about whether those other students were correct. Was she this, that and the other that they had accused her of being, all sorts of annoying things in their eyes? And I did my best to answer her honestly and kindly, and that was really hard actually. But she was open to that honesty. And later in the afternoon, I received a knock at my dorm door and I opened it and it was her. And I was just so struck by how beautiful she was. And this beauty was beyond anything to do with her features. Her features had not changed, but the beauty, yeah, it just really struck me. In fact, I don't think I had ever been struck by such beauty before. And that, I think, is an indicator of how this wasn't your normal run-of-the-mill, everyday kind of beauty based on physical features. And she said to me, I just wanted to let you know that I feel better. And I said to her, I can tell. Yeah, that's wonderful. And she said she had gone to her room and done some yogic breathing exercises, which she always found helpful. And anyway, she just felt the urge to come and let me know that she felt better. And that has stuck in my mind over all the years. And I remember feeling so grateful that she had been prompted to come and tell me and show me the change in herself. Because, like I said before, the beauty that I saw was not the usual kind of beauty. And I'm just so glad that I saw it. It's like evidence for me, or a really strong example of what the Course talks about, that when the body is used for the function of communication, of healing, of expressing love, that it will be beautiful, healthy, but it's not the same kind of beauty or health that the world talks about. And I think that in that moment, through doing the yogic exercises, which were just the language that this particular person liked, enjoyed, and could relate to in terms of healing. But I think the real source of her healing really was being able to forgive those people she had overheard talking about her. Because now what she displayed to me was no harm done. The beauty, the health, the peace, the happiness, or joy really, that was emanating from her, and the wholeness was saying, not one note in heaven's song has been missed. I am untouched by anything that those people said, which means I am not a symbol of their guilt, that I am not suffering anymore. And I'm not suffering anymore because I have chosen to identify with my wholeness. So I thought this was a nice tie back to Mizoguchi. The central problem, he said, of his life was the problem of beauty. And he would have found a wonderful answer in the Course and its definition of beauty and how that beauty comes about. Then, with that definition in mind, he need never feel little again. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast. We've come to the end for sure this time. Thanks for listening and tune in again. Bye.